Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Growers Live. I am Josh Satin and have a very special guest, maybe two, I'm not sure. But we have Heidi and Evan of Small Axe Farm in Vermont, and super special. And I'm really excited. Anyways, before we get to that, not many announcements. In 2 weeks, we'll have Terrence Leahy, the intellectual agrarian, who's an amazing podcaster, and also a organic inspector. So we'll talk everything organic inspecting and organic stuff in 2 weeks. So that'll be super cool. Otherwise, some things to know about Evan and Heidi. They're off-grid, which is fascinating to me as a high-production farm. They've also been doing this for a long time. They live very idealistic lives and are really incredible farmers and grow a lot of food for their community and are just really conscious about a lot of things involved in this. And I just, in a short conversation, I've learned a lot from from Evan. So let me get Evan in here and Evan, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. For some reason, I just blinked off.
Yeah, I don't see your video.
Huh. Um, Pretty much as soon as you went to introduce me, the screen went black. So
All right. Do you want to log out, log back in?
sure, yeah.
Let's, let's give that a shot.
Yeah. What would be the best approach to that?
I don't know, just
Um,
close this and then re-click on the link.
okay, let's see. Already close that. Let's see. Hang up. Would it be hang up or?
Yeah, give that a shot. All right, we'll be back with Evan in a minute. This is always the fun of doing live shows, is that you never know what's going to happen with connections and all that stuff. And Evan was like, "Yeah, if anything happens, I'm screwed." So hopefully you get this figured out. But just he's calling back in. Let's get him in there. All right, we got you now, Evan.
Great. Excellent.
Okay. Cool. All right. I don't know what happened. I was like trying to hold everyone's attention for a little while, and I didn't really have much to talk about. So, all right, let's. Evan, why don't you introduce yourself? I gave everyone a little bit of an introduction, but if you could introduce yourself a little bit and talk about your farm and some of the stuff going on there, that'd be cool.
Great. Well, my name's Evan Perkins, and my wife Heidi and I run Small Axe Farm in Barnet, Vermont. Heidi's out planting shoots, sunflower shoots and pea shoots right now, so she might pop in if there are questions that are more appropriate for her. So you might see her. And we've been farming. We've been homesteading here since 2006 is when we moved in, but we bought the property in 2002. And we've been farming since 2008, and we have a biointensive off-grid market farm, and we've been no-till from the beginning, besides for breaking ground for our first beds.
Cool. And so one thing I find fascinating, Evan, and not only chatting with you, but also listening to the podcast you did with Jesse, was that you kind of developed a lot of these systems like independently of all the internet stuff going on, because you guys didn't even have internet till a few years ago, right? Like, how did that whole progression go down for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, we started off probably around 2000, really get into gardening and farming, and my wife Heidi started a farm program, and so we pretty much learned from books then, but went to workshops. Like, she went to a movable greenhouse workshop with Elliot Coleman, like way back then, and we that was a time when a lot of the work that Elliot had done was kind of getting out there to a lot of people, and there was a lot of people kind of poo-pooing it, saying, "There's no way you can make that much money off of an acre of land or whatever." And we were like, "Yeah, probably not," but we just kind of so that was kind of we had a lot of information to begin with. There wasn't much information on the internet at that point, but then when we moved out here and we were off grid, we just didn't have access to the internet for many years, because we just had a flip phone. So we basically ran with that information and developed a lot of systems for ourselves and a way to farm. And then probably around I think maybe 2013 or 14, as someone gave us an old iPhone 3 and we paid for some data, and then we started having internet. And yeah, that was kind of and then from there we realized, oh, hey, we've been developing all this stuff alongside of a lot of other farmers who started with the same information and developed some of the same systems based on that information.
That's super cool. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
We also were very low income during that time, just because that was our lifestyle. And so we weren't even buying any new books. So, it was really just kind of the information we had.
Okay, so I want you to talk a little about the lifestyle aspect, because I know that's super important for you and your family, and that you sort of got into this for the lifestyle, for living off-grid, homesteading, and then sort of that progression into farming. Can you talk on that a little bit and why that's important for you guys?
Yeah, I think it was like less about lifestyle, although that was really important, and more about just living a life that we believed in. And finding a way to do that. And for us, homesteading was a way for us to make sure that our life energy was going towards stuff that we really believed in, and that we could choose not to support a company or a system that we just didn't agree with. And then farming as a profession was a natural extension of that. We've certainly had to make our compromises along the way in that regard, but it still has allowed us a certain amount of freedom to be able to do something we really believe in that when we go to bed at night, we can sleep easy in terms of our energy was well spent, and our time on this planet is kind of going towards the things that we really care about.
Awesome. And I think the thing that I wanted you to talk a little bit more about was, you guys started this farm with very, very little money and sort of built it over time and very gradual. And I don't think that's an approach that a lot of people are very happy with that answer. And they're like, oh, I want to start a farm and I don't have any money. It's like, well, you can do it. You have to take a different approach to it.
Yeah. We started with zero money when we decided we wanted to homestead, and we don't come from families with money. And I don't have a college education. Heidi had a lot of student loans from a college education that she had to work her way through, borrowing money. And so from that point, we just started saving money, and it was at a time when you could still get loans for raw land, which is pretty hard now. And so we knew that was possible because a friend of ours had done it. And so we just started saving money and then just building all of our skills, whether it's like woodworking, gardening, whatever it was that we felt was important towards a homesteading lifestyle. And while we were saving money, that's what we did with our spare time. And we were saving money from pretty low wage jobs. We didn't have great jobs. And so I think had saved up, and then we got some gifts from family, and so we had maybe $15,000, and that was our down payment on our property. And then from there, we got a toehold in, and then we lived there in the summers, and we built a little cabin. And then all of a sudden we didn't have any bills because we were living without electricity and running water in a little cabin, and just scraping by, trying to keep the truck running, but growing all of our own food. And so the long story short of that, it was a long, slow haul, but people who didn't come from money now own a farm, and have a pretty great life. But yeah, we knew it was going to be a long haul. We don't know where the ending is, or we didn't know where we were going to be in 20 years. But yeah, it was one path to do that. We didn't know anything about leasing land to farm. We might have done that if we thought it was an option, but it just never occurred to us. So we could have started farming earlier, maybe even before we owned land. But so that was, it was successful for us. And I think just important to know, that if you're willing to put in the time and you are lucky, and we have a big foot up being white in America, it's that's a big leg up anyways. Even though we don't come from generational wealth, our families weren't poor, and we didn't come from generations of poverty in that way. And so, we're not pretending that we came from nothing, but we didn't have a lot of financial means when we started this, and nothing has come along our way since. It's everything we've earned. So yeah, I think that's important to talk about, because it's one way in, it's one way into this life, and maybe out of the rat race for people who want to get out.
Right. But if you had the internet back then, you could have realized that you could have leased land. Maybe, no, just kidding.
Yeah. Our life definitely would not have been nearly as cool if we had the internet back, just because all the things we discovered and learned for ourselves, it wouldn't have been as good, I don't think, because our path was very unique and it was hard, but, not being bombarded with ideas and information is helpful sometimes.
Okay. Can you talk a little bit on the, sort of any compromises that have had to be made? I know a lot of people are very idealistic. And you said we were and we are, and like what are some things that you've had to compromise on or change, through the years as the progressions happened and how your life's changed?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there have been like little things like we've always wanted to have our homestead and our farm be primarily free of using fossil fuels. We wanted to develop a system of farming and living that was as free as we could be in a rural environment from fossil fuels. Obviously, we drive cars, and we don't even drive electric cars because one, we can't charge them, and two, we live on very rough dirt roads, and those vehicles are coming, but they don't exist yet in electric form that will work. But we're going to do that. When the time comes, we're going to figure that out. But beyond that, on the farm, we don't use a tractor. We've always had an old beat up pickup truck, but it's not really integral to our farm system. We logged with horses. We did all these things. And then, we're at some point, maybe 10 years ago, we're like, oh, it'd be great to have a flame weir, but like, we don't want to burn propane. It looks like you just lost my picture again. I'm not sure what's going on. Should I just continue talking,
just keep talking for now, I guess.
Great. Yeah, we'll see what happens. So, we didn't get a flame weeder for a long time just because we didn't want to burn propane. And but it burned such a small amount of propane. And then when we started hiring employees, we were like, wait, like we're not going to use this tool all the time, but when we use it, it's going to save a ton of labor. And that's one person driving maybe 15 miles round trip. We might save just one day a year of them commuting by having this tool. And that's going to be way better than burning that one 20-pound tank of propane, so just little things like that we let get in our way. We've kind of let get out of our way.
Sure. Okay. And so one thing that's really cool is how intensively you guys are growing. I know you have a lot of property, but you purposely grow on basically the smallest acreage you can. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes. Yeah, that's kind of always been our goal. We own 45 acres of land. It was relatively cheap at that time because the land was steep. It was hard to get into. But we wanted part of our land ownership to be conservation. And so for us to farm, we want as much of our land to be wild as possible. And that's also the way we manage our forests. We do log, but we really selectively log to keep a deep forest habitat in our forest, which is very similar to like no-till and regenerative farming, making sure the organic matter stays in the forest and things like that.
Cool. And then, so talk a little bit on the, the season extension and sort of the impact that can have. You guys are in Vermont. I don't know what zone. I'm guessing like 4-ish. I don't know.
Yeah, we're in zone 4, and we're also up at 1,500 feet, which is for Vermont is a high elevation. You get into the subalpine zone at 3,500 feet here.
Okay, so how does season extension play in with you guys? I know if people don't realize, like, that's a lot more extreme than a lot of other places. So how does that work with you guys?
Yeah, so season extension has always been like a major focus of our farming and gardening. Because we live in a northern environment, there's a lot of food imported to this area from other places during the winter months. So we've developed over the last 20 years of farming and gardening just passive season extension using tunnels, row cover, all stuff that people know about. And we produce farm food on this farm, 12 months a year. But in the middle of winter, it's mostly just microgreens that are coming from inside a building we heat. But it's really important for us to be really productive early and late, because for us, that's the time when we're making the most positive environmental impact. By growing food passively in a northern climate, you're really displacing food that's being grown in irrigated, arid areas that are 4,000 miles away from where we live, very long distances away. So we feel like season extension has the biggest impact. It's really great to farm here for 3 months of the year, and we can produce a ton of food in those 3 months in the middle of when it's warm. But it's the season extension that we feel makes the biggest environmental impact.
Yeah, I think that's a that's definitely a thing that's worth thinking about and talking about, because every like pound of lettuce that you put into your local community is 1 pound less that's coming from Yuma or California or whatever. So that's awesome that you're thinking about it in that way. I think that's awesome, Evan. So I have more questions, but I think I want to get into some questions first, and maybe they'll generate some more discussion if that's cool. Evan, I got a picture of you up, so at least we're not looking at a black screen.
Great.
I figured out how to do that, which is good. Okay, so as you guys know, we take questions from our Patreon members, and that's how shows like this are possible, and a lot of the work that we do at No Till Growers is from our Patreon members. So I highly recommend you check that out. And a lot of times you guys you can get your questions in early, and they will definitely get answered. If you do have questions, if you're watching this live, you can put them in the chat, but we're going to do these questions first. So a couple questions, Evan, about off-grid stuff. So of course, like, we'll get into that. So the first one is from Taylor Jameson. Being off grid, are you ever limited by the amount of power you have, i.e. running the cool room, etc.? And with that, how big is your battery storage?
Yes, I mean, I think we're always limited by the amount of power we have, and so we've just built our lives and our farm around that, and optimizing and using whatever power we have to the fullest extent. So in terms of a cool room, we still operate with a root cellar primarily to store food. And our whole farm is set up that we don't store food for on the farm for more than 36 hours. And usually it's less than that. So, and then it's in a root cellar. And then in the summertime, we put ice in that root cellar, and it stays pretty cool. It's not optimum temperature. And we're all set up and we've built it. We just haven't hooked it up yet. It's coming in a few weeks. A CoolBot system, which we'll be able to run in the hot summer months. But again, we may not be able to run that 24 hours a day. We may be running that during the day and then shutting it off at night if we don't have enough power to get through the night, and then turning it on in the morning when the sun comes out. But our farm, we just don't store food for a long period of time. So we have very cold spring and well water that we wash it in. So food gets cooled right away when it gets washed, put in the root cellar. And then we have ice that we have the farmer down the road lets us keep a freezer in his tool shed. And so we get ice bottles from that. If we need it. And we do have a refrigerator in the house, and we generate ice in that refrigerator freezer too. So in terms of battery storage, we have 12 2-volt, I'm trying to remember the amp hours, but they're the kind of the bigger batteries, the taller ones. And then we have about 6,000 watts of panels, or 6 kilowatts of panels.
Okay.
But primarily how we deal with power is we irrigate. We do all the things that we need to do with power during the day when we have it, and we don't depend on our battery storage for big demands overnight. But we do have a fair amount of battery storage.
Okay. Yeah, there's another question here from Chris Fenning. So you spoke about your solar panel wattage on the Farmer's Friend interview, but not your battery storage. I guess we just hit on that. How many cloudy days do you size your system for? And I guess the answer to that was like you just try to do things during the day when it's sunny. Is that sort of the approach?
Yes. That's the solar installers. I always ask, like, well, how many days do you want? And basically, like, we look at power as a resource. And so when the sun is shining, we're irrigating, we're running the green spinner, we're charging batteries for tools, all that kind of stuff, running fans in the greenhouse. And then when we don't have the power, we shut everything down. And so we don't have a big enough power system to run like the big things like the irrigation or a cooler all the time for multiple cloudy days. And we do have a small energy efficient generator that we use when we need to. Doesn't really get used much in the summertime. It's more in the shoulder seasons when it's cloudy here that we have to use it more.
Well, I mean, that makes sense to me. I mean, when I'm thinking about the energy demands are going to be mainly during the day in terms of irrigation, keeping the cooler cold, running fans. Like that's going to happen on the warm, sunny days for the most part.
Exactly. Our highest energy demands are when it's hottest, and generally when it's hot in New England, it's sunny. And then we have like November and December where we might never see the sun for 2 months, and in those months you're going to need to run the generator.
Okay. Okay. And then so there's I guess some other things. What brand and type did you purchase? And then we talked about the cooler. Yeah, basically.
Brand and type of batteries.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm really, this is really not my focus. So
Okay.
I don't know a lot of information about it, but they're Trojan batteries, I think, are the ones that we have. A lot of the battery brands are fairly similar in terms of their performance and their price and everything like that. So we only bought those batteries because there was a place near us that sold them that we could pick them up in the back of our pickup truck, and we didn't have to get them shipped anywhere.
That's a great answer. Okay. Sierra Sunshine is asking about are you using solar to fuel any sort of water drainage or well pump? And if so, what brand? Everyone wants details, Evan.
Yes, I know. Yes. So our well pump, we basically, when we drilled a well, we, Heidi and I cut a timber frame and we sold it and we got some money. And so at that point, we were able to drill a well. And so they just installed 115 volt AC well pump in the well. That's like a standard household well pump. I think it might be a Grundfos or something. So it's a little underpowered for running a farm. It only pumps 7 gallons a minute. We can only have 4 sprinklers running at a time, and we farm on an acre. So it's undersized for what we need. On the pro side, generally it rains in Vermont, except for the last 2 years. But beyond, we don't need to irrigate a ton here generally, but that hasn't been the case in the last couple of years. It's been pretty dry. So at some point, we're probably going to have to up our inverter to a 240 volt inverter, because right now we just have a 115 volt inverter. People who know solar will know what I'm talking about. And then we'll probably upgrade the well pump to pump higher, like a larger volume of water, because we have a good well with plenty of water in it. So we just right now can only pump 7 gallons a minute out of it. So long term, we'll probably upgrade that. But when you're off grid, if you upgrade one thing, you have to upgrade everything else. And so instead of it being $5,000, it's $15,000. So that's kind of how it works off grid. Is it's complicated, and you can't just change one thing without changing other things.
Makes sense. Is rainwater capture a possibility, or is that even more complicated?
Yes, we've done a lot of rainwater capture over the years, and because we live on a hillside, it's a possibility, and like that's on like the big to-do project list. But because our water system does work now, it just has not made it to the top of the project list yet. There's still some other big infrastructure pieces we're finishing first, but yeah, the long-term plan is rainwater capture and then a DC direct powered solar pump to big tanks at the top of the hill above the gardens.
That makes sense.
And that will be a great system, but it's going to be time consuming and expensive, and it's going to have to happen during farming season, which there's only so many projects we can do during farming season.
I'm sure you can't do that in the middle of the winter time.
Nope.
Okay. Very cool. All right, let's see here. Matthew Bader, given the slope, what strategies do you use to keep soil from running off when you're first planting your beds? I guess that's not really the case because you've been growing for a while now, but do you grow specific cover crops or other deeper rooting annuals prior to such planting?
Okay. So in terms of our farming style, like we are always just cutting plants right off at ground level, and plants are growing in our beds, from the very beginning of spring, as soon as the soil is open until it snows. So even when we're turning over a bed to replant it, the only soil that would be loose would be, we do use a tilther. So maybe that top inch is loose, but we tend never to have any deep erosion just because there are always roots in the soil on our farm. And we don't use cover crops in general, though we have used cover crops in the past and we know how to use them. They're just not part of our farming system right now. Right now, there's always food growing in all the beds. That may not be the case forever, but that's kind of how our farm's set up now. And in terms of mitigating erosion, all of our pathways run across the hill. We're on a south-facing hillside, so our pathways run across that hill, east-west. And so any erosion that happens from the surface of the bed, and then it will go down into that pathway. And then we have a cool tool called the Tilly, which there are videos about if you want to check it out, that periodically, maybe once or twice a season, we'll run that tool through, and it basically just shoots that soil from the pathway back up onto the bed above it. And that way you're dealing with erosion in this really micro scale, and we're always moving the soil back uphill after it's moved downhill. And because our beds are across the hill, we don't have significant downslope erosion, except that we do have some paths that go straight down the hill. And you'll see a little, over the years since we've been farming for 15 years here, there'll be like a little bulb of soil. You'll see this that will form at the bottom of the path, where that erosion has happened, but that doesn't happen below any of our beds. So it's very clear visual of like, oh yeah, if you have your beds across the hill, you avoid erosion. And we have been through really significant rain events here where we've gotten 5 inches in an hour or 7 inches in a day, and our farm has survived and seen very little damage through those. Not to say that some big event could happen that couldn't happen that would, really do some damage. That could happen, but so far our systems have worked, and it's been a couple decades or close to it, and that they've worked for.
Cool. I want to break down some of this stuff because you hit on a lot of things here. Because I farmed on, my property here is on a slope, and now everything's under a tunnel, but I did farm in the open for 2 years. And I think one thing that is, for me doing deep compost mulch, which I know you guys are not doing, but there's that fear that everything's going to wash away, and sometimes it does. But I think the biggest point is that once you get plants growing and you leave the roots in the ground, it holds the soil together way more than you think. And I think that does not, I think people overlook that a lot. I think that's usually after you get things growing and the soil gets in its groove, I find that it holds together pretty well. I'm guessing that's kind of similar to what you're talking about.
Yes, it does. And, one of the problems with like a deep compost mulch is it floats. A lot of the materials in it float, so it's really prone to erosion that way because it'll get in the water and be floating on it. And soil is not as much like that. It's not going to go as far before. If it gets a place to stop, it's going to settle out, and that's what it does in the pathway below the beds. So yeah, having those roots in the ground is really crucial to our system, and that's why we've been a no-till. One of the main reasons we've been a no-till farm from the beginning, just for that sheer practical reason. But it was also kind of part of our environmental ethic in terms of carbon fixing from the beginning too. But it just, both those things work together really well. And I don't think it's perfect. I don't think our system is perfect. I know there's some erosion. It's not really visible, but if you live on a hillside and you disturb anything, there's going to be stuff moving downhill. So there's certainly more ground to cover for us on this. But erosion has not been a problem on our farm thus far.
That's awesome. Can you talk a little about your pathway management?
Okay, so because of that erosion issue off the beds on a hillside, although we have deep compost mulched areas and we did a lot of mulching in the beginning, for many years, we mulched all the pathways and stuff, but we found that it was just a big management problem because if we mulched the pathway with anything but compost, which was expensive, and it wasn't expensive for us in the beginning, it was just labor intensive because we made it all ourselves. And if it was like hay, then it had weed seeds. We couldn't afford straw. If it was wood chips, then if that pathway filled up, then those wood chips would have to be put back up into a bed to trench the pathway out again. And that wouldn't work because we can't have wood chips in the soil breaking down and robbing nitrogen. So we went through all these different kinds of mulches, and then we just settled on, okay, we're not going to mulch. No-till is going to be our part of our solution for that, always keeping the roots in the ground. And so now we basically manage pathways by using this Tilly, which basically has a bunch of collinear hoe blades on an electric hub. And basically, like if you put it at an angle, it'll shoot soil out behind it back up onto the bed from the pathway. And that works well for us for a couple reasons. One is we don't pull all of our, like when we're clearing a greens bed, all of that debris stays in the pathway and it mulches the pathway, and it breaks down really quickly because it's mixed with some soil, and it breaks down really quickly. And then any nutrients that run off the bed run into the pathway. So when we go around with that Tilly and put that soil back up on the bed, it's really nutrient rich and is just like a boost for the next planting, basically. So hopefully that explains it, but feel free to ask a clarifying question.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard you talk about this before. So basically, you essentially have raised beds, and all of that extra material will wind up in the pathway, breaking down, and then you kick it back into the bed. So you're like composting in the walkways, sort of.
Yeah, it's compost in place, basically, and that also creates this really intensive kind of biological activity in the pathways. And in the times when I have pulled up like big broccoli roots and stuff, their roots are right down there in the pathway. Like they're feeding from that pathway area as well, even though it's compacted from walking and such. Yeah, I find that the plant roots are right down in there underneath that pathway, because there's a lot of biological activity that happens during that, after that breakdown happens, which is happening mostly on the surface. Then there's just a lot going on there. And for us, that just is a labor saving tool as much as anything else. Like, we're not hauling it out, making compost and hauling it back. It's just staying right in the field.
Okay. So does it tend to wind up being sort of like level, like the walkways and the beds? Are they kind of level?
No,
It's still
our
still
beds
raised a little bit.
need to be raised.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, maybe like the day that we clear a greens bed, it's going to look level, but it's just a bunch of fluffy greens that are
Right.
mixed with a little soil, and within a day or two, they're going to decompose, and then you'll have your raised bed again.
Okay.
And we have very narrow walkways. Our pathways are 11 inches,
Whoa.
so not wide walkway.
On a slope.
Yep.
Okay. And how wide are the beds then, Evan?
30 inches.
Okay. Man, 11 inches. I'm like, that's crazy. All right. I had 14 at my place, and I was like, it got hairy sometimes. And now I'm doing 12 in my tunnels, and I'm like stepping on everything. So good for you, man. That's awesome.
Yeah, we always when we're hiring like employees, I always look at their feet. It's like, just so I know, it's not like we're not going to hire someone with size 14 feet, but I know there's certain jobs they're not going to be doing.
All right. Yeah, you can't say that. Be like, sorry, your feet are too big. We can't take you here.
Exactly. Yep. No bed prep for you.
Do you guys have small feet? Is that why you? No, I'm just kidding.
Not particularly, but they're in a reasonable range. We both have like around size 10 feet. So
okay. And so with the walkways and the slope, like, I'm sure there's some challenges there. Like, what about harvest totes or other things like that? Like, how does that work for you guys?
Yeah. So we tend to use like kind of those, we use blue Rubbermaid harvest bins, and then we use kind of green, like the green kind of trugs, which I think are Gorilla trugs or something now. So they're kind of leaning up on the crop and half in the pathway. There, you can't just set that bin down flat, or the bin might be on what you just harvested. So yeah, bin management's a bit of a pain, and so they end up getting put on top of stuff sometimes. Really what that small pathway is about is part of it is our like conservative nature in terms of just wanting to have as little space as possible to maintain, to put amendments into, and to have as much space open for wild space on our farm as possible. That was always our intention from the beginning. So the smaller space we can use to grow, the more space there is for wild, for the wild, nature just to do its thing, of which nothing we're going to do in a market farm is better than what nature is going to do if you leave it alone. And that's kind of the principle we start with. And then the other thing is our slope is so steep that if let's just say we had a 16-inch wide walkway, then you would end up with a really high bed wall on your the bed that's above the walkway. The bigger your walkway, the more flat space that's taking. And so you're going to have each bed's going to be an even bigger terrace on the hillside.
Right.
So the smaller your walkway, the more, the less extreme drop you have from the edge of your bed down to the pathway.
Right. Also, just having a smaller footprint is less walking, less irrigation if you're using overhead. I feel like there's so many advantages to that if you can make it work.
Yeah, and there's a lot of like minerals and other things that you add maybe once every 5 or 10 years, and you're going to add them to your whole space. And so if you have walkways, if they're smaller, that's that much less amendments you're having to add to your garden as well.
Okay, so is anything terraced, or is just everything sort of on contour, bed by bed?
Yeah, it's pretty much, we don't do everything exactly on contour, but it's pretty much on contour. Um, and then we do have like our gardens down by our house, our terrace. Those were the first gardens we made, and they're part of our farm. And they are terraced and they're beautiful and we love them. But in between each terrace, you have kind of this grassy area. And and then you have the next terrace, and so you have this area you have to maintain in between each terrace, which we didn't want to continue as we expanded our farm because it's a lot of work. It's really beautiful, it's great to have living pathways, but they are a lot of work to maintain. So that we didn't feel like that was an expandable system for how we wanted to farm. And generally we made those terraces by just like driving in little short cedar posts and putting the junky boards that came off of our sawmill, as the terrace boards, and we would replace them every 4 or 5 years.
Okay. Have you
Now?
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Now a lot of those terraces are permanent. There are no boards there anymore. It's just because the soil and the living pathway is just kind of holding everything up, and there's no need to actually have a terrace.
Have you seen Sage Hill Ranch Gardens out in California? We did some videos with them. Spencer Rudolph. I don't know if you've seen any photos or videos of their farm.
Yeah, and they had a lot of pretty big excavated machine-made terraces. Yes, yep.
Yeah, it was
there on a slope.
it was. I think I'm just guessing their slope is probably a little bit more intense than yours. I'm just maybe not. I don't know. But yeah, it's pretty. I mean, I've been there. It's pretty steep.
Yeah.
But he said that they did like terrace bed by bed, and there were so many issues with like where do you stand, and like everything just falls off the edge, and they had all these systems worked out for that because it was too steep for them to just like go with the slope. They had to terrace, and then they did a bunch like single beds, and they did some doubles, and now they're just clearing out like 8-bed blocks, like bringing in big machinery to cut through the hill. But I guess it's, your system's working. I don't know why you'd want to do that.
Yeah, no, we have no interest in that. And just like that, we've had to do some like around our house and for our farm building and our one heated greenhouse, we've had to do excavation, and it's kind of distasteful for us. It's not something we love to do. We'd rather have when we leave this land, have it be able to go back to a natural state, and have it look kind of like it looked before we came. So that's just more of a personal preference for us. And then it's not like our system works great. It takes all of our employees. It takes some getting used to. It is harder work. It's a little less efficient, certainly than a flatbed. And there are just some things that it just takes a little more time, or mostly it's more skill using the tools when you're trying to run seeders and paper pot transplanters. All that kind of stuff is harder on the slope, and so it's more of like developing hand skills, which just means like we pay our employees more when they learn how to do that stuff really well. It's high skilled work, and like we can pay them more because we know we're getting great value for that higher rate of pay.
That's funny you mentioned that, Evan, and I realized that too because I farm on a little bit of a slope, and I had someone come over and like show me some tools and stuff, and they were like struggling so hard just to like move around, and I was like, "What's the matter with you?" And they're like, "The slope," and I'm like, you don't think about it after a while," and like he like was struggling, and I was like, "Oh, it's because it's sloped here. You're used to growing on flat land." But yeah, you do get used to it. It's tricky to walk and move, and the balance is just a little bit different. But yeah, it definitely takes some time to get used to. That's funny.
And I think on the plus side is our hill is south facing, and those slope beds, even in our northern climate, give us at least a couple extra weeks of growing on either end of the season. Because when the sun is low in the sky, it's hitting our slope just right, that it heats the soil to the maximum amount, and it's hitting that front edge of the bed, and it's just absorbing any sunlight we have. Our hoop houses that are sloped inside up on the hillside, as compared to our one that is flat down by the house, are 2 weeks ahead in the springtime from the same planting, just because those slope beds absorb that solar heat. And then it's beautiful. Like if you're farming in a vertical landscape, like it's stunning. And it's not just about the view. It's just about like, looking up and having that beautiful bed of cabbage be above your head, and then looking down and seeing, just these rows of greens unfolding below you. It's just something about it that, and I think for everybody who farms, that aesthetic, that beauty about, of being around all these amazing plants is, part of why we do it. And the slope just enhances that for us.
And so, yeah, I agree completely. What can you talk about? Can you talk about your tunnels a little bit? I know that tunnels generally they tell you to put them on flat ground. So, like, how have you guys dealt with that?
Well, our tunnels are from Ledgewood Farm, he's a fellow over in New Hampshire across the border from us, who is a farmer who just started making tunnels for himself. And he actually farms on sloped ground. So, when we said, he was like, all right, we've a bunch of different ways to solve this problem when we first talked to him about it. But yeah, how we deal with our tunnels is they're running east-west across the hillside, just like our beds. And we do make it fairly level where the ground posts go in on that east-west axis, but the ground posts on the southern edge, to the lower edge of the tunnel, are 2 feet lower than the ground posts on the northern edge. And so we just have longer ground posts, basically. So the southern wall of our tunnels, we have 21-foot wide tunnels. That's kind of the length. That's the widest tunnel that will work on our slope without having to have an engineered tunnel. Basically, we have regular ground posts on the north side, and then they're 2 feet taller on the south side. So, if you look at it, if you forget about that 2-foot extension, the greenhouse is flat and it looks flat, but it's, we just have a big, tall south wall.
Okay. And so the beds are still just on the slope inside the tunnel.
And the beds are still on the slope inside. Nothing changes inside. And for some of them, we did have to do like a little bit of terracing just to get them to work on the steeper sections, but very little.
Cool. Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, I have my nursery is from Rimmel, and they were like, no, you have to level it. So I had longer ground posts on the downhill side, just so that it stayed level. And then my Farmer's Friend tunnels, I just put them on the slope. They've been fine. Like the tunnels, they look crooked, but like it's been working fine. But for the bigger tunnels, they need to be, I guess, more level to put them in.
Yeah, we have cat tunnels, a couple of Farmer's Friend cat tunnels, and we just put them in regular, although it was before they were making ground post extensions. And so next time we move, we're going to buy the ground post extensions so that south wall can be, but they've been fine. We haven't had any problems because of that. Any problems we've had have not associated with that.
Yeah, the end walls are fun on the tunnel. That's all I have to say when you do it on the slope. A lot of geometry.
Yeah. Well, we're farmers. We just rough it in. We don't try not to do too much math.
I used to be a math teacher, so I'm like, and taught geometry. So I'm like, oh, we got to get this. But there's a lot of times you're just holding things up and marking it. You're not like calculating stuff. So yeah, I get it, man. All right. So Liam Dolan here asked basically about your paths and stuff. So I think we kind of answered that already. Yeah, it was all the questions about all that stuff. So let's see, guys, you have questions in the chat here, and let's get to some of those. I mean, we have some more stuff to talk about too, but let's see here. Barry's, can you see the text on the screen there, Evan?
Yes. Okay.
I guess we kind of talked about this renewable energy off-grid systems at your farm, kilowatt needed for your operation and solar costs.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we've run our operation with virtually no solar power, with 1,000 watts of solar power, and now we have 6,000 watts in varying battery storage along the way. So we ran our farm, with virtually no power, and now we feel like rich in power with our 6,000 watts and our 12 big 2-volt batteries. So I think it's best not to think about it, kind of like with how much you need. It's just like, what can you practically afford and what can you do with it? That's kind of how we looked at it. Like, what can we afford? And then, okay, we've got this power. What is the best use for this power? And for us, it's irrigation. That's the primary thing. Our root cellar works good for storing the vegetables. So, we got by for a lot of years with just that. And then running, when we got to the point where we could run a washing machine to spin dry the greens, that was a huge step for us. And that was on a pretty small system that we did that. And then you also just gonna offset, like, how much are you willing to run a generator? Like we've always sized our farm so we're not running the generator all the time. But some people just be like, this is our only way forward. We got to cool the vegetables. We're in a southern climate. We're off grid. You're going to run a generator for that, and that's not the best thing in the world, but it's not the end of the world either if you're doing a lot of other good stuff on your farm.
Sure. I think like harvest days would be a time that might be a big constraint because you're trying to keep things cool. You're trying to run your washing machine, spinners. Is that like has that been a bottleneck over the years?
Not really, no, no, because we're really just running like the green spinners and stuff, and now like our solar power is pretty appropriately sized for our farm, so we can have a couple green spinners running, lights on in the farm building, and be irrigating, and even if it's like unless it's like dead slate gray, there's a lot of power that's coming into the panels. Even on a cloudy day, there's enough to kind of run that whole load for the most part, and then we have batteries. So we're not doing that high intensity running the spinners all day long on a harvest day. That's just going to be for, maybe 3-4 hours in the morning.
Okay.
So
is
not a big issue.
Is your house tied in all to the same system? I don't know if you mentioned that before.
Yes, it is.
Okay.
And the only thing that really demands power in our house, like, is a refrigerator in the summertime. In the wintertime, we don't even really run the fridge unless we can now with our power system for most of the time, but we'll unplug it at night and take some ice bottles out of the freezer and just stick them in the fridge. But because we started with no power, we just have like lights and music and the computer. And so we just don't have any and we have a washing machine, but you just run that when you have the power to run it, and vacuum and that kind of stuff. So we don't have a lot of power use in our house. We heat with wood. So there's no, for our house, we don't have a high demand. One thing that is high demand in the wintertime is we do have a wood gasification boiler that we just got 3 years ago. I guess about 3 years ago. And that heats our farm building, and it also in the springtime heats us so we can get a little bit of a jump and have some slightly early tomatoes and stuff like that, and heats our seedling house. That takes a bit of power. And so in the dark parts of the month of the winter, we have to run the generator, several times a week. If it's cloudy all the time, just to recharge the batteries. That's the time when we use the generator most, is in the winter time for that wood boiler. And we just couldn't find any good way besides propane to heat a greenhouse, besides having this really efficient wood gasification boiler. And we just didn't want to go down the road of a propane heated greenhouse. And we're surrounded by wood here. It falls across the driveway. We cut it up into firewood and burn it. So.
Okay. Next question here is, thanks Josh and Evan for the conversation. Evan, do you have any maples on your property that you tap during February, March for syrup production?
We do have a lot of sugar maples on the property. For years, I just helped my neighbor tap and traded him for syrup. If you're a season extension farmer, February and March particularly March gets really busy. So we didn't want to bite off making syrup too, which, if you live up here in Vermont, is kind of like you feel obligated. But we're happy to trade our neighbors. And for years, I just help people tap their trees and their sugar bushes, which is my favorite part of making syrup. Is being out there in the spring, in the late winter, as the sun's gaining in the sky, tapping those trees. So that's always what we did. But in the future, maybe if we scale back the farm when we get older, we might start sugaring here because we love it. But it's not part of our operation now.
Okay, but you guys put maple syrup on everything in Vermont, right?
Everything, yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. What changes have you noticed in your farming that are due to or consequences of climate change issues? Hi, Evan.
Hi, Don. Many. I mean, I think, climate change in itself is hard is a hard thing to pin down. That's why it's hard cognitively for people to understand. But in the time that we've lived up north here, we've noticed that there are longer wet spells, longer dry spells, and it's generally warmer. And what that means is like we've definitely had seasons where for a month and a half it rained like every day, from like the beginning of June through mid-July. But before that, it was dry from the end of March until it started raining sometime in June. And so that makes farming really hard. If it's too wet, you have a lot of disease issues, although our farm is really set up well for wet because the water drains off and we get a lot of breezes up on our hillside. But in the last couple of years when it's been dry, it's just a huge stress on us just trying to keep our plants alive during these dry spells. Because we're off grid, we can't just immediately just pump more water. We have limits. We do have a good well, but that probably has limits too. So those are the things we worry about due to climate change. And then just, forestry was really my personal first love in just watching the forest degrade as the climate changes and losing tree species. And those are heartbreaking things that I've watched in my lifetime. So yeah, those are the big things that we've had to deal with, and just the extremes, just that, there's always been dry times and always been wet times, but when they come every 3 years as opposed to every 7 years, that's a big difference for a farmer. If you have a season where you have losses every 3 years as opposed to every 7 years, it's a big difference. It can make the difference between survival and or success and failure, because it's like you have a narrow profit margin to begin with, and then all of a sudden your losses are coming quicker at closer intervals, or the amount of resources you need to combat those potential losses are higher. And we do need to just spend more resources to run our farm because of climate change, because we have to be prepared for super wet and super dry.
All right. All right. We got some questions here coming in about your root cellar. So I guess the first question is, how is the root cellar working out?
Great.
How large is your root cellar?
So our original root cellar, which is we just recently built another one, but our original one is about 6x8 on the inside, and it's just packed to the gills with boxes on harvest day. And it's buried on 3 sides. It has a really well insulated front wall. And we kind of built it by hand, like with slip forms and stone and concrete. And then we just built a bigger root cellar that's like 8x11. That's closer to our farm building, and that's not fully insulated on it. It's got almost 2 exposed walls and 2 buried walls the way it is. So we have to really insulate those exposed walls. And so that's not totally done yet, but that'll be really nice. And then, and the root cellars are amazing. They're amazing tools for keeping food cool. Like it'll be in the 40s right up until about now. And then with ice, we can keep it like right around in the high 40s, pretty much through the summer. But on its own, it'll be in the 40s and right up until about now, which is kind of mid-June-ish, or we're right around the solstice now. And then we're going to get cold nights coming in the end of August and early September. And we just leave the doors open on cold nights, and it will cool right down back into the 40s again at that time of year. So we just have this short window in July and August where we put ice in there to keep it cooler.
Okay. And people want to know how tall it is and what direction they're facing.
Okay. Let's see. The root cellar, it's pretty short. Our original one is maybe 6.5 feet high on the inside. We just wanted it to be really compact. And we are on a south-facing hillside. But our first one is behind our house, so it doesn't get direct sun because it's right behind the house. But the open wall does face south, but it's really insulated and in the shade. And we also have like some sumac trees that they kind of grow on top of it and around it, and they shade it all summer long. All right. And they're the kind of tree, if they get too big, you can cut them down, they'll just regrow.
Okay. All right. Justin's asking, knowing what you know now, would you tell your past self to do things differently from the very start?
Yeah, I don't really.
It's a tough question, man.
Yeah, I don't really. It's just never really how I looked at life. And I think for both Heidi and I, we've we've tried, we're both people who thrive under challenging circumstances. And, you know, I think we did the things that we needed to do, and we learned a lot along the way. And could we have taken a different path? Maybe. But looking back, like, there's not a lot that I would change. I don't live with a lot of like, oh, I wish we'd done this earlier. Because for everything you gain, like, for instance, it's great to have access to the internet now, but you lose a lot by having access to the internet. I developed so many relationships early on because it took me 3 months to answer a question. And I finally found the one person who could really explain it to me, and developed a lifelong relationship and an understanding of a whole different part of the world that I never would have learned about or known about if I hadn't met that person, because I needed their information. So that's just an example of like, yeah, maybe it would have been great to know what we know now then, but that's not how I look at it, because there's so much we gain from not knowing and from having those challenging circumstances bring out parts of ourselves that, ended up really benefiting us later.
Absolutely beautiful. It's your journey was your journey, it's unique for you guys. All right. Let's see. Get a couple more questions in here, I guess. So is there any crop or variety of crop that you're trying this season that you didn't grow last season? If so, what and why?
Okay. Yeah. Let's see. We've got a few things. I think the thing that we're really excited about now, and it's something I trialed last season, just doing some trials on it, but this season we're selling it, and they're really just coming into it right now, are bunched baby shallots, and bunched baby leeks, and Johnny sells a variety of onion called Nabushan onions, which are really flavorful, way different than a regular white scallion. So we're just trying these kind of like different baby alliums to sell as scallions in the stores, but really having them labeled well, because the flavors are intense and they're so different from the leek. The leek, if you fry it up with a little butter and put salt on it, it kind of tastes like a cross between a leek and asparagus. Like, it's got a really amazing texture and flavor. And the shallots, likewise, are kind of like eating an onion ring if you just like saute it in a pan. And so we're really excited about them because we like to eat food. And also in Vermont, leek moth is encroaching the state, and basically what that is that the leek moth will, like, it'll go down through the stem into the onion or the garlic, and then a maggot will form, and then that maggot at some random moment will tunnel out the side, usually right after you've sold it and it's sitting on your customer's counter. So we don't have that on our farm yet, but there's a lot of farms around us that have just had to stop growing alliums because of it. And like everything, who knows how long it will last, but we just wanted to kind of like expand our we grow bunching onions and we grow storage onions, but we just wanted to expand our allium repertoire in case, like, for the next several years we might be dealing with something that's going to stop us from growing bunching onions or stop us from growing storage onions.
Yeah, I actually grow Nabushan as my like green onion variety, and that, man, the flavor and aroma out of those are just incredible. Like, incredible. I totally get it. And I think there's a good point there. And I just had this discussion recently, was that, just because like one variety of onion or one variety of carrot is working for you, it may not always work for you. So you always have to be having a diversity of varieties going, in case something does happen, like that pest or something else that happens.
Yes. Yeah. And also just, we love to farm and we love to discover new things and eat new things. And so that part's also really important.
All right. So let me switch gears. I know we got a couple more questions coming in, but it's something I wanted to talk about before we were done tonight, Evan, in that you've been farming or homesteading, farming, market gardening, whatever, for like 20 years or so. And so can we talk a little bit about sort of not necessarily like the small scale farming movement, but sort of the tools and innovations and stuff that most people have seen in the last few years, but really, like, these are sort of older ideas, and, can you talk on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, I think we were kind of young, idealistic gardeners who wanted to be farmers, and kind of right around 2000, and we had read a lot of Elliot Coleman's books, and because we're in the Northeast, we actually visited his farm at one point and knew people who apprenticed for him, and so he was a real innovator in terms of tools. Tools like the tilther he invented, and different flame weeders and different shapes of hose. And it's not that he invented everything; he just was just good at putting the information out there through workshops, through his books, and so that was a real inspiration for us. And so we watched, because he was a farmer who was into tools, and we were kind of had access to his information. That made us excited about tools, and so we've watched this. A lot of the tools we use now have been around for a long time, and that was, and then there's some, and so we started our farm with growing greens with just scattering our green seeds like chicken scratch on the beds, and then we got a Johnny's 6-row seeder, which was awesome. Like that built our farm, that little seeder. But it has some limitations in certain soil types. So we've recently have got a JP5 cedar from a Jang cedar, and that's incredible because it can be wet, it can be dry, and you can plant with that thing. So we've kind of gone through kind of different cedars. The Farmer's Friend Greens Harvester, like we read an article on it in 2012 and bought it as soon as we possibly could, because we saw that along with that 6-row cedar, that's going to build our farm, and it did. And so we still have that first original one we bought, and now we own 2 newer ones, because the first one had 1 million little parts, because Jonathan had put it all together and figured, I'll just add this here, I'll add this here, and now it's a pretty streamlined thing. So it's been awesome to see the evolution of that tool and how that one tool has really, really helped to make small scale farms more profitable. It really has. Like, I'm not just a promoter, not to promote his company, but just to be honest, like we're big believers in that, and the whole idea of that. And then the paper pot transplanter, that was in Vermont. There are a lot of Vermont farms and New Hampshire farms that had that pretty early on, like in 2013, 2014. But we couldn't afford it at that point. So that's something we use. But again, that's a tool that's been around since the 60s or the late 50s. I think it was invented in Japan. So I guess the long story short is a lot of these tools have been around a long time, or the idea of them or some iteration. And I think they're going to get way better. I think we're just still in the very beginning stages of this development of tools for market farming, and we're going to have a lot more awesome battery operated, lightweight, portable tools, coming our way. I'm sure there are people out there making them and designing them. It's not going to be me, but I'd be happy to throw ideas to anybody who wants them.
I love that you. I love that you say that, Evan, because to me, getting in this is my 4th season growing, and tools like you mentioned, and I love a lot of the Farmer's Friend tools. And they have been a sponsor on this show, and they've sponsored my YouTube channel too, and I own a lot of their stuff. But frankly, the Greens Harvester is incredible. Like, I can't even imagine not having that tool, and for you to have seen that come out and be like, yes, I will buy that. Like, I will use the crap out of that. And things like the tilther, or I have a Jang cedar that I absolutely love. I am so excited, as you are, to see what's coming next, and your enthusiasm and sort of positivity about what you imagine coming out soon. And I don't know. Yeah, if people are designing these tools, let us know. We'll give them a try.
Yeah, and I think I hopefully there'll be a lot of space in for more people to get their ideas out. I think if people, there are some tool companies out there, and they're just companies are a great way to produce tools, but oftentimes, like the Farmer's Friend Greens Harvester, the tool came first and then the company came.
Right.
And that's happened more too, because, companies are sometimes not the best people to be developing the tools. And so hopefully there's some of both, and there's some great inventive farmers out there who invent something practical and either license it to someone else to make or start their own companies doing it. But I think they're really important because we started our farm with, I've had since my late 20s, I've had a degenerative condition in my back. I have a really bad back. I've had 3 surgeries, periods of time when I just couldn't walk. And I farmed through that all. And part of it is because of these tools, so there's a lot of tools we have that keep us from having to bend over as much. And they make the farming more practical. And for us to be able to envision us still doing it in our 60s, even though we both have like issues with our body. We not only do we work hard, but we play hard in our off time. We paddle, we mountain bike. When we get time off, we go into the wilderness and get as far out as we can. And that's also hard on the body too. So these tools really make it more possible. And I think like one big thing about tractor row cropping is it really eliminated a lot of labor. You can put your seeds in the ground from the tractor. You can cultivate, you can harvest, all that kind of stuff without having to bend over as much. But those tools can all happen for market farming too. And they have happened, and they're going to continue to happen to take some of that stress on our bodies, allow us to still have that good exercise that comes from actively farming, but take away some of the things where humans are just not really built to bend over. And as we get older, we can't squat forever. Like our knees, it just doesn't work for particularly Western people. It seems to not work as they get older. So there's a big place for that. And I am really hopeful about that. I think it's going to just make this style of farming more and more practical as we get better tools.
And I think also, I agree with you completely. I think also the fact that so many people are getting into farming from different backgrounds, I think is so cool because everyone has a different take on things. Because a lot of the people I talk to don't have farming families or come from farming backgrounds. So they approach things like completely differently. Like, I don't have any preconceived ideas about how I should farm. I look at what's out there and I'm like, hey, that looks like that makes the most sense to me. And I think it's important to point out that a lot of the stuff is really old. And, I think there's probably a lot of farmers getting into this now who don't know much about Elliot Coleman because he's inspired all the people that everyone else is now reading and watching and learning from. But like, look at Elliot. I mean, he's, a lot of his things, like just like, for example, like the collinear hoe, which I don't know when that was actually invented, but to stand more upright, to be better on your body, because vegetable farming is very physical and very tough. And Elliot's still like farming a little bit, I believe. When the last time I talked to Clara, like you can't get him off the farm.
Yeah. And I'm sure the collinear hoe was invented, 1,000 years ago in some form or another,
Yeah.
But he really popularized that and that style of tool, which is great.
All right, let me take a couple more questions here, and then maybe let's see here. Another question from Justin. Have you thought about having animals on the homestead? I don't think you have any now that the horses are gone.
Well, we just got 2 kittens, and they're amazing. So, as far as animals, we always loved having animals. We raised our own animals we lay our hens, and we raised our own animals for meat, pigs and turkeys and chickens. And, but we, at some point, had to choose, like, we're either going to make this farm work or we're going to have animals, and we're not going to do both. Just because living off-grid life, things just take longer. There's more work involved with things. You can't just flick the switch. And so animals take a lot of time, and a lot of that time that we may have had to put into animals is taken in running our lives off grid here. Particularly at the time period when we decided to not have animals on the farm anymore. So, and we're surrounded by farms with animals. Our neighbors have horses. There's dairy farms around. There's tons of animals around. So, if we want to trade for animal products or we want manure or anything like that, it's all right here, right on top of our hill, really. And so, we don't feel a real need for them, besides for the fact that we really like raising animals. We like being around them. And so, as we get older, we may, and maybe if we get more efficient on the farm or we scale it back a little bit, we might get animals, but they're not a part of our plan right now.
Cool. Yeah, it's really hard to do everything. I know, coming back to farm at my home property, I was like, I'm done with chickens. Like, I gotta keep it simple. Like, once you have animals involved, it's like, it's a different pattern of your day, of your week. just your time, and it adds up. All those little things add up. Let's see here. Sierra's asking, are you foraging in the wild areas for additional cash crops like wild mushrooms or native greens?
We do a lot of foraging for mushrooms and seasonal greens in the woods, but mostly for ourselves. We don't do that as part of our business, but as part of our lifestyle, yes, definitely.
Okay. And then I have one last question, I guess. Where the name of your farm? What's the origin with that?
Well, the small axe is there's an African proverb, which I don't really know the exact words to, but basically that, the line is, if you're a big tree, we are a small axe. And the intent of the proverb is that little people can make big change, and that was like from the beginning, and we are still, feel like some ways we're fighting an uphill cultural battle to live the life that we want, and particularly with our environmental values and just our values in general about just living close to the land and taking care of the planet and so yeah, that was kind of where it came from. But we originally learned it from a Bob Marley song.
That's what I was gonna. That's exactly what I was thinking of when I heard that. Yeah, totally. Okay.
And so and so that was where we had first heard it. And it's a beautiful song. It's on like an early recording of his, and at the time when we bought our land, we were living at this private boarding school and around teenagers all the time. We've always kind of been around teenagers, and they were really into it when like the idea came up, and we were like, I don't know if we want to name our farm after a Bob Marley song, but it just kind of stuck. And at some point, like Heidi was making some pottery and she wrote it on the bottom, Small Axe Farm, and then it just kind of stuck. But it fits us. I'm also a wood carver. I've hewed a lot of beams with broad axes and things like that. So there's so many different layers to the name for us, and so yeah, we love it. And yeah, that's where it came from.
Very cool. I mean, that was my initial thought when I saw that. I just thought about that song. Also, I don't know if you've seen there was a documentary about Bob Marley. I'm sure there's been a few, but there's one I watched and actually explains the story behind that song. And there was a recording company. Do you know that story?
No, I'd love to see it.
Yeah, I'll see if I can find that and send that to you. But yeah, I guess the name of the recording company and the guy that screwed him over was called Big Tree or something like that. And so that was part of that story of that song. Anyways, for those music nerds out there, I probably botched that story. That was a long time ago that I watched that documentary, but I'll see if I can find that for you, Evan. Well, Evan, really beautiful story, beautiful farm, and beautiful life that you guys have, and I think it was very inspirational to hear what you guys have going on, and I really appreciate you taking the time out to talk tonight. And is there anything else that you want to add to the conversation before we wrap it up?
Not too much. I think mostly just we have been very blessed in our life to live the life we have here on this land, and to be able to have had the great luck and fortune and privilege to have accomplished what we have. But life is hard and messy and dirty, and things don't work out, and there's been a lot of pain and sorrow along the way as well, and that's just all part of the package. We love all of that for what it gives us, both the joy and the pain. And I think that's important. That if someone looks at a life like ours and said, "Oh, that's like a perfect life," it's just a life. It's another life, and it's a good life, and we like it. And there's a lot that we're proud of, but it's also a challenging life.
All right. Well, amazing, Evan. Thanks so much for all of your insight and for all your hard work, and wish you guys the best success with the season, and have great success this year.
All right. Thanks. Thank you so much, Josh.
All right. Thanks for coming out tonight. All right. All right. Well, big thanks to Evan. Hopefully you guys were touched a little bit with Evan's story and everything that they're doing on their farm. It's just so cool. Anyways, big thanks to Evan for coming out. I guess Heidi was busy with planting microgreen seeds for this entire time. Maybe we'll have them back on and have Heidi in too. We'll try to figure that out. But thank you guys so much for tuning in tonight. And if you don't know that this is also available in podcast form, you can look up Growers Live. We'll see you guys in 2 weeks with Terrence, and we'll talk all about certified organic stuff and all those kinds of things. So again, thanks so much for all of your support with everything with that No Till Growers is doing. Really appreciate it. And we'll see you guys soon.